Well, good afternoon. I guess it's still morning, isn't it? Good morning. And when Ewan was talking about industry, he didn't mean the UV industry. I've been in, actually was CDC until about 3 years ago. Spent 33 years in there doing government type stuff, which I guess is why I thought I could talk about government framework. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to just talk about government framework. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding risk because that's important. Talk about influencers, regulatory framework, and then we'll go back to influencers again. But let's talk about risk for a minute. How many people here have jumped out of an airplane? Why? Okay, that's a risk, right? Well, I've got a little video to make sure everybody understands risk because risk can change over time. So here's a guy getting ready to jump, pretty excited. Look at that. That's not me. Then here's this next guy. That's more me. And Bud Light. Okay, it's not over yet. So what happened to risk? Okay, risk changed a couple different times there. So when we're talking about risk, people have different perceptions of what really is risk. So what we need to understand in the beginning is we have to balance, and this came up earlier today, is we have to balance risk with benefit. I was the one that shouted cost earlier in case you didn't recognize my voice, but it's also cost and benefit. So we need to balance our stories. And when we're talking about risk and benefit, the risk of infection, with no intervention versus risk of infection with intervention. And then also, what's the risk of some of the transient adverse health effects? And then we also have, and based on some of the discussion we had about the potential for some of the indoor air chemistry issues is, what are the risks of some of these secondary adverse health effects? And then what's the risk and benefit of perhaps reducing UV a smidgen in some cases, because we really don't have a good dosing strategy. We have an idea, but not a good dosing strategy. And that in turn would lower the potential risk for some of the indoor air chemistry. So when we talk about risks and benefits, we need to take a look at the whole picture, not just UV on, UV off, far UV on, far UV off. So let's talk about influencers to UV. I'm stepping back in history. I was with NIOSH at the time. In 1991, there was a call to NIOSH saying, oh, we've got UV in our hospital. There are all kinds of problems. There's some other problems too. But I just did this in large print for people who may not have their glasses on. But one of the findings was the potential for overexposure to ultraviolet irradiation exists for those who work around functioning UV. Why is that? That's because there were fixtures that were chosen, installed, and then the people ran away. It was never tested. So what ended up happening was the nurses who were actually on a raised platform got overexposed. So that was a big black eye for upper room 254. Now, I'm not picking all the examples, but recently, last year, at a college, UV 254 was installed. And I'm not just picking on 254, I'll get some 222 stuff in here too. But the fixtures were upside down. So instead of louvers up, it was louvers down. Yeah, that's not super bad, but not good. But they're also installed lower than they were supposed to be installed. So it made a big flap. And I really like this experiment with UV. So there's actually a communication problem here. So what we have to be concerned about is, how do we make sure stuff is installed properly? Rolf mentioned the project with NALMCO, so I'm not going to go into much detail other than it's a collaborative effort with a bunch of these alphabet type groups. But they have on the left here, you'll see their lighting certifications, and what we're proposed, or it's been approved by the board, is to essentially insert UVC instead of lighting. In UVC, we're talking about all wavelengths. It'll include far UV. I'm not going to get into the argument of UVC, UVD, far UV and whatnot. But anyway, the idea is to have at least some minimal competencies for people who actually install and before you turn the switch or the building management accepts the project. Now, to talk about some more influencers, most of you probably have seen this paper, but the title. And this morning they raised the issue, and yesterday Holger raised the issue of what about the titles? This is an alarmist title. It shouldn't be in any kind of peer-reviewed journal. But when you actually read about this, they had 2 kilowatts of UV 254 in a room. Do you think that's going to affect indoor air chemistry? Well, if it didn't, then they were doing something wrong. So we really need to make sure that as we do messaging, that we understand, what's the ramification of something like this? And if they had talked about, something much less sensationalized, then I think I wouldn't have to show the slide to you. There's another one. I'm not just picking on any one group, but there's several documents about 222 that also, to me, are a little bit alarmist. Now, is this factual? Significant production of ozone? Well, there's ozone production, but people are going to take that, as we talked about in the previous session, wave it in front of you and say, oh, PJ, oh, Holger, oh, somebody else, we're not going to let you do this. Or you get unions involved or other groups of people involved, and they're going to say, we can't do it because of this or that. So we really need some kind of a balanced approach that gives both sides of every story, so that you're prepared. So when somebody comes up and says, oh, in this case, you may have ozone generation, and here are the limitations, and this is how you control it, so that there's a solution along, recognizing the issue and coming up with a solution. And I think most people, not everybody, will agree with this, that we're basically the worst barriers to acceptance, because as academicians, as government regulators, as industry people, we want to show people the facts, just the facts. And that's not, as was mentioned earlier, that's really not what the customer needs. And then we also have to find the customer. Is it the end user? Is it the department chair? Is it the person in procurement? Is it management? So, and you're going to have different messages for each of those levels. So we really need to deal with that. But for the first sub bullet here is mainstream social media are sort of a close second to us as being barriers to it. So let's talk about regulatory reform, because again, I just want to get a few of these influencers out front when we talk about regulatory reform. Well, historically, new regulations come out in the US after a tragic event. Now, luckily, we haven't had any deaths due to UV that we're aware of, nor would simple exposure to UV, whether it be 222, 208, 230, whatever wavelength you want to pick, that's not going to be an issue. Now, what about the initiative of regulatory agencies? Well, let's explore this a little bit. Let's talk about exposure regulations. Does the US OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, have any exposure regulations for UV? The short answer is no. The detailed answer is, well, they can sort of cover it under the general duty clause, so it's not an absolute no, but there's nothing specific for UV. Does NIOSH have any regulations for UV exposure? Well, they're not a regulatory agency, so the answer is no, but they do have recommendations. Are there any other agencies, none that I'm aware of, that have any exposure limits? And then IES, again, isn't a regulatory agency. However, they develop consensus standards, which a lot of people will adopt. OSHA, under the general duty clause, may, depending on the compliance officer, say, okay, you need to meet this. And even though it's not a US regulation, it's a consensus standard. Now, how about efficacy regulations? Well, let's go through, some of the main groups again. EPA and FDA, I said nope. And it's sort of a qualified, I hate to talk in absolutes, but for slides, I put it in absolute and then qualify it. So if you take this picture, I'll probably get beat upside the head. But, there are some parts of different agencies that say, okay, you have to have a 4-log inactivation, or you have to have a 6-logging inactivation. What organism do you have to have that inactivation at? Well, that's not always specified. ASHRAE really doesn't have any efficacy regulations because they're not a regulatory agency, but they do promulgate consensus standards and guidelines. And there's a big difference between a standard and a guideline. We'll talk about it a little bit. But let's talk about EPA for a moment. EPA does have regulations about misbranding. So if company were saying, oh, we can kill 100% of X. Well, nobody can kill 100%. And kill probably isn't the proper word anyway. So there are some regulations under EPA where somebody might hound you depending on what you're proposing. FDA has some regulations related to radiation, and I have some friends in the FDA, or used to have some friends in the FDA, but a lot of the FDA folks think of ionizing radiation, not necessarily non-ionizing radiation, so they don't always get the correct interpretation of, in my opinion, of things. And since I'm no longer a government employee, I can give you my opinion and not get in too much trouble. But let's get back to efficacy for a minute. There really are no dosing strategy standards or regulations. There's some recommendations, but there are really no standards or regulations. So, this morning somebody was saying, well, give us a number. Do you want it in equivalent air changes per hour, equivalent airflow rate, equivalent, Holger mentioned average fluence rate. There are many different metrics. Or do we do it based on exposure limits or go to ACGH and the TLVs? Well, there's really not consensus yet, but that's one thing that whether it be IUVA or the other ICFAS or whatever, but we really need to tackle that problem as well. When we talk about dosing strategy, I just mentioned a few of the things here: the average fluence rate, the volumetric dosing, the area dosing. That's just a typo, and whatever you can afford. Because a lot of times when one goes in with a proposal, to do a reasonable proposal, they really need to understand what kind of budget you're dealing with up front. Otherwise, they come up with this X price, and the company or organization may have 10% of X, and then they'll say no. So that's why the risk assessment, the cost benefit, everything really needs to be understood before one does that. How about industry initiatives? Well, let's take a close look at industry, and the next slide, I hope to make a stronger point, but if we take a look at global HVAC equipment market for 2022, it was about 560 billion with a B US dollars. If we take a look at UV, and that's all UV, I didn't put it in here, this is also UV curing, it's all UV, including air, surface, water, and I forgot to type in curing, is 450 million US dollars. So what does that mean? That means the ventilation industry outspends the UV industry by 1,200. What does that mean? The golden rule. How many people know the golden rule? He who has the gold rules. So that's something else we have to work in synergy with, not against, but in synergy with the ventilation folks. Because once we get the ventilation folks buying in, that will help the architects, it will help the codes, which will help the architects, which will help all of you make it part of that layered approach that we've been talking about. So while the golden rule is important, I want to posit the following, and that's, and don't throw anything at me, please. The UV industry is poor promoter of what? Evidence-based supporting UV technologies. What do I mean by that? Well, I probably should have said plain English evidence. So it's not that, oh, well, we had, a 99.7341% reduction with a confidence interval of this to that. Well, they don't need that. They want to know, is there a significant reduction? What's the benefit to me? That's the messaging we need. UVC in general, I say in general because there is confusion about terminology. There's confusion even on the EPA website about, if you take a look at their ultraviolet pages, most of their pages are dealing with sunlight. They mention UVC in the banding, but everything else is UVB, UVA. So I think it was Ed mentioned earlier that the ultraviolet term is something that we can't change. He didn't say we can't change it. I'm saying that, but we need to make sure people are aware of where this UVC, including Far-UV, falls. Mainstream social media, and there are a number of people here working on some of the consensus standards, and with certain organizations, and I don't want to name ASHRAE, but if you take a look at if you take a look at 241 and the committee that drafted it, how many UV people were on that committee? How many say goose egg? And that's it. So why wasn't there either a layered approach including UV or a higher recommendation for UV? Well, UV wasn't at the table. What does that mean? Remember the golden rule? That's probably part of what happened there. How about consensus standard bodies? Okay, June 27th, there's hopefully a final ballot. It'll pass, but it's titled Standard for UV, which means all wavelength, germicidal equipment and systems. Some people are calling it a safety standard. It's actually a product standard. Why do I call it a product standard? Just because somebody passes this UL test doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. They install it at the manufacturer's height and they take some measurements. And if it's installed properly, blah, 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 all those qualifications, then there's a good chance you won't be overexposing anybody. But let's take a look at what do they do? You get the, there we go. They have what they call general use height, which is the distance between the fixture, whether it be different types of fixtures, and their measurement, which is 6'3" from above the floor. And as long as they don't exceed the TOV converted to it and the irradiance level, it passes. And then you have to put all this this signage and whatnot on the fixture. Is that what we need? People on the committee will probably tell you I was a little bit critical of it, but well, I won't get into that. There's some other UL standards that I'm going to draw a parallel to. This one is one which it's in harmony with Canada and also with IEC. So essentially, it's word for word the same standard. This is a standard for electric chainsaws. Are they inherently safe? What can happen? I had to find a picture without too much blood and gore, but this is an electric chainsaw I have at home. And how many times do you think I've read that fine print on the thing? So, it says read the manual. That's pretty important, but it really doesn't tell me, how not to cut my leg off or my arm off or something like that. So when we talk about standards, we need to make sure we understand, okay, how does that standard help me? How does it help my customer? How does it help in terms of overall public health? And not all standards, will meet all of those ideas. There are a number of IES documents that obviously you have to pay to get them. And I'm not making any commission off of IES document sales, but there are two documents that deal with safety. UL has a couple, and we won't really debate it here, but they've got a couple standards that deal, it maybe not properly or completely with ozone, but they deal with ozone. This is that draft UL document, and they have another one for portable units. Dave Sliney had talked about the HGH TLVs. Now it's not a consensus standard. It's just an organization that came out with recommendations, which are really the only recommendations out there for here in the States. There are various CDC, NIOSH recommendations. And again, those are not standards or regulations. Those are just recommendations. And then in italics, these last two documents, GPC 37 is not a consensus standard. It's just will be an ASHRAE guideline, which will help with some of the issues of safety and installation and whatnot. And you've heard already about the 241P, which the latest draft passed the ballot yesterday and should be ready for prime time early July. That's all I can say about that. But most won't be happy. So to just kind of summarize what I did for this opening, I tried to be just a tiny bit provocative because the speakers that follow me will correct me and or address some of these issues in their presentations. But that's from the standpoint of regulatory framework. It's really, for the US, it's kind of helter-skelter. There's not a definitive, catch-all for everything related to UV that manufacturers can hang their hat on and say, this is how to do it. It's, endorsed, or maybe not endorsed, but it's covered under certain consensus standards in the with the different consensus bodies, and it's covered by regulation saying, if you can do this and this and this. They're somewhat confusing. They're somewhat contradictory in between agencies. Again, because there's not, I didn't have it on here in case somebody were taking photos, but I actually originally had limited cooperation between federal agencies. And, as a former Fed, I can say that because, not everybody wants to talk to everybody else. They all have their own marching orders, which aren't always the same. And now remember the influencers. I spent more time on influencers in the regulatory framework because there's not much in terms of regulatory framework, but we can influence the regulatory framework. We can influence the consensus standards. And that's what I have here for the three bullets for influencers. One is the UVC, and again, I'm doing the broad stroke, not just 222, is really a suboptimal influencer. So coming up with a stronger IUVA position and background, this potential ICFUS2 or whatever you want to call it, or some other kind of industry group, I think will help a lot. There's also an uphill battle with other industries, ventilation, that we have to deal with. And again, it's not against those industries, it's with those industries. And then there's also somewhat of an uphill battle with some regulatory agencies and consensus standard organizations. So on that note, I hope I at least got this session started. You at least laughed at one of my jokes, so I think I was successful. Oh, no.
Do we have any questions for Paul?
Now, Ewan didn't tell me I was going to be held accountable for any of my statements.
Paul, would you comment on the time motion issue with regard to UL's single highest point approach?
And you don't want a one-word answer, right? No. Okay. What if you understand the TLV is based on joules per square centimeter or total absorbed UV over an 8-hour period for a healthy, used to be male, but now it's a healthy worker. What UL and some people have done incorrectly is divide that by, 8 hours times 60 seconds or per minute and 60 minutes per hour, and come up with the average irradiance of 0.21 microwatts per square centimeter. So what UL has done is they've taken that point, meaning that you're going to stand there and have the detector, in this case, stare at the fixture for 8 hours straight, and then they'll be at the TLV. What Ed is talking about by time motion is, unless you want to get fired, you're not going to be standing in any one position in a room, staring at the light for 8 hours continuous. Now, you may find situations where somebody might, we had a situation where it wasn't in the US, but there's a UV fixture in the middle. There's a guy, and it was a guy watching TV, and, he wasn't looking directly at the light, but the light was shining into his eyes. It was above the 0.2, it was closer to about like 0.6 microwatts per square centimeter, and he got photokeratitis. So we have to understand time motion. It's not that everybody's going to be moving all the time. Most of the people will be moving some of the time, but there may be situations where people aren't moving, and then we have to have a more conservative benchmark for declaring a situation safe for the occupant. So when I go into a facility, and it may be too long of an answer, when I go into a facility, if it's an office where people are moving around and whatnot, I'll definitely go well above the 0.2, because I know they aren't going to be standing there staring at the fixture. They may be sitting at their desk half the time, and then you've got 0.1 or less at their eye level for 254, or lower for the 222, or if you're somebody like Dave Sliney, you've got your detector on top of your head, and you're worried about the 222 shining down on you. So anyway, we have to, when we go into a situation to assess it, it's not just a simple assessment. And that's why with the funding through Baldwin Foundation, University of Maryland, NALMCO, Dave Sliney and Rolf Bergman and I are working on this certification training.
Paul, thank you very much for this presentation. I agree basically with everything, but for the rest of the audience, I am part of some standard committees as well as Paul and a few others, and I can only say, if you're not participate, don't complain.
Yeah.
It is a complicated, frustrating, long-term process, and it's usually a negotiation. I have to be honest, in some of the standard committees, I'm only there to prevent more damage. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But we need more people from the UV industry to be active and sometimes loud to make progress or to prevent bullshit.
Right. And in Holger's credit, for this one group, we have people from China all the way to the west coast of the US. So I'm up at 4, and I think that's early. Holger's up at 1 o'clock, or maybe he never went to bed. I don't know which, but he's there at those meetings participating. Thank you. There's one way up there.
Isn't the risk issue more about attorneys and the law? I mean, there are pharmaceuticals now that promote different medicines that will kill you as a side effect. And people still buy a lot of, that medicine. So, my question is, should the legal profession be brought into the discussion as to how do we not, get past that point where, there is no return? And also many people have mentioned it, but I don't think it's mentioned enough, is the performance issue. So making sure that the standards are not just about, how to put things at the proper level, or, right, irradiance or fluence or whatever we want to call it, but that it actually works. So.
Yeah, the first rapid fire set of 3 questions are yes, no, yes. or maybe it's no, yes, no. But for risk, there are really two types of risk. There's the legal risk, lawsuit risk, and whatnot. The other is the risk of transmission, which they're somewhat related, but they're really independent. So if I go into a facility and let's say it's a healthcare facility and they have an administration building, they see no patients other than perhaps during the peak of COVID, I would say that's a relatively low risk area and it'd be low priority for an intervention. So when we talk about risk, we need to make sure we understand what we're talking about. When the slides that I showed were really about risk of transmission versus the benefit of and cost of the intervention.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Paul.
Thank you.